All right, the title of the final presentation of this session of this afternoon is Geopolitics and Cultural Heritage since 1974, Weaponization versus Reconciliation. Our host will be Ms. Nina Shea of the Hudson Institute. And our featured speaker will be Dr. Elizabeth H. Prodromou. She's a professor at Boston College and holds a PhD from MIT. She's among the world's leading experts on Orthodox Christianity and the geopolitics of the Eastern Mediterranean, and we're very pleased and honored to have her. So join me in welcoming Dr. Prodromou to the stage.
Thank you, Zach. Good afternoon to everyone. It's a little bit difficult to be the last speaker on the first day, but I hope I'll make it worth your while. I want to begin by thanking AHI, the whole team, especially the CEO and President Nick Lediakis, but his entire team. So it's a pleasure to be here. Let me remove my glasses here. It's also a pleasure to share the stage with my dear friend Nina Shea. We served together on the USERF, so it's wonderful to be together. Okay, what does cultural heritage have to do with our reflections on 50 years of a divided Turkish-occupied Cyprus? To answer the question, let me start with some basic data points by way of introduction. First data point. In a 2008 public opinion survey that canvassed Cypriots on both sides of the Green Line, 92% of Greek Cypriots and 72% of Turkish Cypriots surveyed answered that protecting cultural heritage of the one community that's located within the territory of the other is important to trust building that could enhance settlement negotiations to end the island's partition. So 92% of Greek Cypriots, 72% of Turkish Cypriots underscored the importance of cultural heritage for a settlement. Second data point, a senior program advisor for USAID, now retired but still living in Cyprus, who has worked on Cyprus for many years in bicommunal peace building, noted in a 2015 publication that, quote, saving Cyprus' cultural heritage was never a main objective of the U.S. foreign assistance programming on the island. But then she goes on to say, ironically, some of the most tangible and recognizable examples of the U.S. commitment to peace building on the island involve bicommunal cooperation on cultural heritage projects. So never a real priority, but high returns, low investment. Third data point, the government of the Republic of Turkey has an extremely well-developed state-funded cultural heritage policy, particularly in terms of the cultural and religious heritage identified with its Greek Orthodox and Armenian Orthodox Christian minorities. And the interministerial authorities in Turkey, or interagency authorities in Turkey, have exported that policy to Turkish-occupied Cyprus. They've adapted it to the specifics of the occupation zone, and they've implemented it there with funding for and cooperation with the Turkish Cypriot administration. And then my fourth data point, which suggests, I hope, that cultural heritage is important for our reflections here today. My fourth data point is that given the cultural heritage approach of the Turkish and Turkish Cypriot administration in the occupied north, along with the failure to make progress on the UN formula of a bizonal bicommunal federation, it's no surprise then that the Republic of Cyprus has demonstrated its own reluctance to engage in bicommunal cultural heritage projects that might have corrosive implications for the sovereignty and legitimacy of the internationally recognized Republic of Cyprus. And Nina, when I'm at 15 minutes, can you give me a flag, please? Thank you. So I'm starting with these 4 points in order to try to make a persuasive case for understanding why, and then considering how cultural heritage policy can be understood as a central component of any effort to advance negotiations towards a solution at this really interesting conjunctural moment. So, some claims. First, the significance of cultural heritage on Cyprus has been underappreciated by all actors concerned. Second, cultural heritage cuts in many different directions. It can be understood either as a weapon for division, mistrust, and memoricide, or it can be understood as a tool for reconciliation, respect, and an appreciation for the rich history of the island. Then a third claim, cultural heritage policy needs to be understood as a geopolitical variable. In terms of Turkey's policy in occupied Cyprus, cultural heritage policy has been part of a geopolitical strategy of territorial revisionism, known by many in terms of the Blue Homeland Doctrine, or under the guise of neo-Ottomanism, but more generally has been a tool by which Turkey is trying, as does Russia, to carve out its own near abroad in the form of a Turkish world with all the disruptive consequences that this suggests. So in here, if we think about Russian discourse and Turkish discourse, Russian actions and Turkish actions, Cyprus, occupied Cyprus, becomes very instructive, and cultural heritage is part of that overall set of strategic actions. So let me make a few points about what's happening with cultural heritage. First of all, there's been a general paradigm shift in international law that involves the convergence between cultural heritage protections on the one hand and human rights protections on the other. It's now 75 years since the adoption of the UDHR and the signing of the Genocide Convention, and international law has evolved to recognize that the protection of cultural heritage and the protection of human rights are inextricably linked. So to be clear today, when we speak about cultural heritage, what are we actually talking about? We use the term a lot. What are we actually talking about? And I wanted to point out, we're talking about both tangible cultural heritage and intangible cultural heritage. So in terms of tangible cultural heritage, there we mean movable and immovable property, such as monuments, architecture, art, history, archaeological sites, groups of buildings, museums and their content, libraries and their content, manuscripts, objects of artistic, historical, or archaeological interest. When we talk about intangible cultural heritage, here we're referring to the practices, the representations, the expressions, the knowledge, the skills that communities and groups and individuals recognize as part of their heritage, their identity, and that are transmitted generation to generation, usually at many of those sites that I just mentioned. So intangible heritage also generates local economies around those tangible sites. Now, you can probably see where this is going in terms of Cyprus. What we see is that in these definitions of cultural heritage, there's an emphasis on chronicity, on the passage of time. There's an emphasis on the ethical dimensions of cultural heritage, the intrinsic value that communities assign to both tangible and intangible heritage. And there's also an emphasis, it places the human being at the center of all heritage discussions. So if you've eliminated the human beings, then you can also eliminate the heritage. And then finally, in terms of human rights law, we've moved in international cultural heritage law away from a focus simply on property, and now we talk about heritage, because that includes both property and intangible heritage. In human rights law, we've also seen an expansion through multiple generations of human rights protections, from political to economic to social to environmental and to cultural rights. So it's well understood now in international human rights law that the protection of culture, and therefore the connection to cultural heritage protections, is part of all international legal frameworks. Now let me move quickly and say a few things about Turkey and its export of its own cultural heritage policy to occupied Cyprus. For those in the room who don't know, the deep roots of the Turkish state's cultural heritage policy lie in the founding conditions of the Republic in 1923. And significantly, there's a basic continuity in this policy. It cuts across both the Kemalist and the Erdoganist periods. And I think this is an important point for us, because in the policy space, certainly in the academic space, but that's spilled into the policy space, there's a tendency to think that there's a sharp division between the conception of nationalism in these two periods. But in fact, if we look at nationalist historiography and cultural heritage policy, we'll see that there's a basic continuity. So Kemalism, secularism, and Erdoganism, Islamism, are both models of nationalism that are intrinsically similar. They're committed to the state's hegemonic management of religion, and they aim to build an ethno-religiously exclusivist form of national identity that's incompatible with a democratic logic. So whereas Kemal's national identity project, expressed in the Turkish historical thesis, argued that it posited the superiority, and these are quotes taken from the Turkish Review of Anthropology, posited the superiority of the Turkish race as masters of the country, as masters of the country over the Greeks, the Jews, and the Armenians, who were descendants of a mongrel race and whose inferiority can be scientifically proven. If we fast forward to the present, Erdogan's neo-Ottomanism amplifies the Islamic dimensions of Turkish identity, of Kemalist Turkish identity, in a 21st century model of nationalism that reduces non-Sunni Muslims and non-Turks to a putatively protected position of separate and unequal. Now, this is the logic that informs Turkey's cultural heritage policy. And the policy itself, it's a nationalism project then, and it involves an interlocking set of state institutions: the Diyanet, the Directorate of Religious Affairs; the Vakıflar, the Directorate General of Foundations; the Ministry of Culture, and the Ministry of Tourism. And most importantly, it also involves some associated institutions as well: ministries of education, environment, urbanization, and climate change, and a host of intelligence actors. All of these institutions, in terms of the Turkish state, are meant to reconfigure tangible and intangible forms of cultural heritage according to the nationalist model that I mentioned. Now, within Turkey, there are lots of examples of this. I would say, and we don't have time, but I think the Hagia Sophia fetish of the Turkish government, and that's what I've coined their systematic reconversion of every single Hagia Sophia church in the greater Istanbul environments to a mosque, to mosques. There are many, many examples. The reconversion of the Hora church to a mosque, the use of the 1942 Varlık Vergisi, the wealth tax targeting Jews, Greeks, Syrians, Syriacs, Armenians to expropriate their properties, et cetera, et cetera. All of these are cultural heritage tools that affect the tangible and intangible heritage of the minority communities in Turkey, and they also have violated their human rights: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, rights to property ownership, freedom of, I mentioned freedom of assembly, freedom of thought, conscience, belief. This policy has been exported deliberately by Turkey to Cyprus, to the Turkish occupation zone. And this, now let me turn a little bit to Cyprus. We see these same institutions, in particular the Diyanet and the Vakıflar, the Ministries of Culture and Tourism. They've all been replicated in the occupation zone as part of the self-styled TRNC. And the local Turkish Cypriot authorities have operated with the same objectives: destruction, expropriation, appropriation, and commercialization that amount to a wholesale, comprehensive violation of human rights under international law. And I think it's important here to mention parenthetically that some Turkish Cypriot members of the Technical Committee on Cultural Heritage, this TCCH in Cyprus, that was established in 2008 to include heritage experts from both sides of the Green Line, they've argued that the Republic has propagandized the Turkish occupation and Turkish Cypriot administration's record on cultural heritage management and human rights issues. But the facts speak for themselves. So for those of us who are here reflecting on the last 50 years, all we need to know is that there's extensive documentation by the Republic of Cyprus, by the Church of Cyprus, by other religious communities, the Armenian, Latin, Maronite Christian communities, as well as the Jewish community, and from independent experts that provides documentation and photographic documentation and eyewitness accounts of cultural heritage destruction, either by neglect or by purposeful action that's been perpetrated by both the Turkish occupation troops and the local Turkish Cypriot administration. Illustrative in this regard is the fact that the director of the Office for Combating Illegal Possession and Trafficking of Antiquities of the Cyprus Police recently estimated that over 16,000 artifacts, including mosaics, murals, icons, and other items, have been looted and trafficked internationally since Turkey's 1974 invasion. Individual and institutional buyers of the pillaged cultural heritage from the Turkish occupation zone have extended as far afield as the United States, Germany, and Japan. And as we know, in June 2024, the governments of Germany and Cyprus actually signed the historic repatriation agreement. That is a positive move to returning some of those looted artifacts that ended up in Germany. Now, time is tight, so I'm going to try to wrap this up, but if we look at Michael Janssen's authoritative works on Cyprus, his 2005 War and Cultural Heritage, Cyprus After the 1974 Turkish Invasion, and then his 2012, The Loss of a Civilization, Destruction of Cultural Heritage in Occupied Cyprus. I think he sums up succinctly, and this is his quote, "Turkey's political demographic partition of Cyprus and its cultural heritage and human rights policies have not only ruptured the unity and integrity of a modern nation state, but in my words, have also erased and reconfigured the millennial cultural integrity of the island." So another point for our reflection here today concerns not only the facts on the ground, and this goes back to my question to Das Huck, who just left, but the language that the international community uses when it comes to Cyprus, which has focused on Cyprus as a frozen conflict. Because I think what cultural heritage and human rights violations in the occupied North show is that this conflict is not frozen, that in fact the cultural heritage policies of the Turkish Cypriot administration and the occupation regime are an ongoing expression of the conflict, absent active conflict, but nonetheless, these are practices that are violent in their expression and in their consequences. So I think we need to change the terms of our discussion when we talk about Cyprus. It's not a frozen conflict. It's a conflict that continues if one looks at what's happening with cultural heritage and human rights. And there's a kind of chronicity here that amounts to a form of memoricide. It's the everyday killing of memory. That's what we're seeing in the occupied North. And finally, there's a geopolitical logic at work here. In other words, cultural heritage policy, as I mentioned at the outset, has been tied to geopolitics. And in this case, heritage policy is about Turkey's revisionism in the Eastern Mediterranean and more broadly in the Middle East. Because what we're seeing in terms of its tangible and intangible destruction or appropriation or commercialization of properties in the occupied North, we're beginning to see in northern Syria and also in Kurdish Iraq, where Turkey violates the sovereignty of its two neighbors there with regularity. I'd be happy in our conversation, Nina, you and I can talk about this in more detail, to say a little bit more about some successes when it comes to cultural heritage management in Cyprus, but I also want to close with some what can we do? Reflecting on the past, where can we go from here? One, I would suggest a paradigm shift in how all of us in this room and all stakeholders on the island and in the international community understand the intrinsic linkages between cultural heritage protections on the one hand and human rights protections on the other. And I think international religious freedom, freedom of conscience, belief, and religion, and all that goes with that is a critical fulcrum connecting those two. I think we need a paradigm shift in recognizing that cultural heritage isn't some sort of soft niche issue. In fact, it's a geopolitical issue. It has geopolitical value and geopolitical consequences. Thirdly, in terms of actual policies, with the new incoming administration in the United States, I would urge that the IRF reports on religious freedom and human rights and also all others associated with Cyprus recognize occupied Cyprus rather than the euphemism of the area under control of the Turkish Cypriot administration. I think Michael Rubin recently wrote a couple of articles and characterized that language as stupid, so I'm quoting him. And then I think the second thing is beyond language, the need to push for the UNDP and the EU to increase their funding to Cyprus Technical Committee on Cultural Heritage. Also seek funding for that committee, the TCCH, from other entities like the Holy See and NGOs to expand the collaborative work that has yielded some positive results. Build out the Heritage Youth Ambassadors program on Cyprus, both in numbers and activities, scope of activities, in order to promote leadership skills and intergenerational training related to cultural heritage and human rights protections. And U.S. program monies under public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy could be used for this. When it comes time for the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs to renegotiate MOUs on issues related to cultural heritage, think more broadly about heritage issues, not just with regard to looting and trafficking. And then finally, integrate cultural heritage into the U.S. recently launched U.S.-Cyprus Strategic Dialogue, especially under those components of the dialogue that deal with education, culture, and people-to-people ties, and also in the section dealing with security, crisis management, and law enforcement. I looked through the dialogue, the text of the dialogue, and I noticed that there was absolutely no mention anywhere of cultural heritage, and yet cultural heritage and human rights protections would fit neatly under those sections. And then finally, just to close, I think the most important thing is to hold violators accountable. And since Turkey is the occupation authority on the island, under international law, Turkey is responsible as the occupation state for all that goes on in that zone. And so I think that in terms of Turkish state institutions in the mainland and that receive funding on the northern part of the island from the mainland, things like visa suspensions, targeted sanctions against individuals who are complicit in or direct a cultural heritage and human rights policy that has led us to today could begin to make some change, even if it's incremental on the ground. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. You really demonstrate in that talk why you're such a pioneer in the conceptualization of cultural heritage linkage with human rights and broader geopolitical concerns. I had the educational experience of traveling as a commissioner with Elizabeth. I was appointed by the House Republicans, she was appointed by the House Democrats, but we became very close as we traveled through Turkey, which was an eye-opening experience, and through Cyprus, including the occupied part, in a delegation that Elizabeth really engineered and, or I should say led. Really an eye-popping experience to see the destruction of the sites, the physical remains of the civilization that had lived there for so long. And I have vivid memories of those churches and that were destroyed, and others that were maybe another that was under intimidation. But can you give us some details about where that stands? I mean, it really looked like a territory in parts in ruins.
So, am I on? Yeah. We traveled, I think it was in 2009, 2011 with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I think that was our third visit to Turkey, but our first visit that also included travel to the occupied sector of Cyprus. And we saw, as Nina said, what has been documented in so many photographic and so much photography of the occupied north. We visited one church that was on a Turkish military base. It was in disrepair. We visited, I think, one of the most memorable visits that we made. We went to the Church of Ayos Sinisios in Rizokarpathos, and what we saw there was quite interesting. And this is where I think we come back to cultural. It's a beautiful indication of cultural heritage as a geopolitical project and a nationalism project. Because when we went to the Church of Ayos Sinisios, in the square, what you see is the small, beautiful church. Directly across from the church, facing the entry to the church, is an enormous, a quite colossal statue of Mustafa Kemal on horseback. So if Mustafa Kemal were actually galloping with his horse,
charging,
he would have entered directly through the front of the Church of Ayos Sinisios, which is symbolic because this is exactly the recollections of the conquest of Constantinople and the entry through the imperial gate of Hagia Sophia on horseback of the conqueror in 1453.
Yeah.
And then behind the church, up on the hill, overlooking and dwarfing the church, is an enormous mosque, a recently built mosque, and I'm not sure if it was built under the Erdogan government or the previous Kemalist governments, but again, the semiotics are interesting because what we see is the semiotics of conquest. Everything from size to positioning. The messaging is very clear. And so what we saw in this example in the occupation zone was the way in which cultural heritage and also the limitations on human rights in terms of using the church, access to the church, having to get constant permissions, etc., intimidation in using the church, all of those are connected to the broader geopolitical project of Turkey's domination of the region and its territorial revisionism.
Yeah, really, ethno-cultural cleansing does not describe what has happened there, what Turkey did there, because it's not just a cleansing, it's a replacement of a different culture.
Right.
And that, I think, illustrates, your report just now illustrates what you mean by tangible. Tell us about, could you go into further detail about this intangible, because we heard that too. In testimony, basically.
Right, and I think that's been, again, going back to the point about changes in international law, there's been a move beyond this idea of culture as property, but instead cultural heritage as tangible heritage, but also as intangible. So intangible heritage is all of those practices that occurs around those sites and independent of the sites. And here I'll give another example from the occupation space. The first time that I was lucky enough to travel to Cyprus when it was free and united was in 1973. And I remember visiting the wonderful church of St. Barnabas, Ios Varnavas. And I'll never forget this. I was a teenager, and outside in the front of that church were monks engaged in iconography. Well, iconography, that church is now in the occupation sector. Iconography is one of those intangible practices. So things like textiles, things like iconography, things like music, things like food, all of those practices that go along with identity expression that are oftentimes very much linked to particular sites, whether it's a library or a museum or a house of worship. And also, most importantly, I think, that help us to understand how people remember and transmit across generations who they are. And so when you eliminate the tangible heritage and you eliminate the intangible heritage, you're engaging in a process, and this is a term in the literature, of memoricide. It's one of the dimensions of genocide. And what's also important, this takes us back to this point about the language we use, oftentimes Cyprus being described as a frozen conflict. Memoricide, or the erasure of memory, can occur absent active violence. If you prohibit people and communities, individuals and communities, from those practices that allow them to remember, you don't need to be engaged in war or active conflict. You can use policies of intimidation,
demoralization.
Demoralization, exactly, that destroys intangible heritage.
Yeah, I'll never forget the conversations we had with some of the congregants of those churches that were now in the in Cyprus, and they were saying that, you know, this church that my parents are buried near, I can't visit. Where we were married, where our children were baptized, we can't even go there. And then they said that some were saying that we're permitted to go for one day a year, but they weren't allowed to pray there. They could only hold a picnic.
That was the Armenian church.
Yeah, which just seemed gratuitously cruel and controlling, frankly. It was just, if there's a security concern, why would you allow them at all? So there isn't. So why does Cyprus matter? Why should it matter in the larger picture of the, why should the cultural heritage part of it matter to the larger picture, the geopolitical picture?
Well, I think it matters.
And as a human right, as a human rights issue, can you say why it matters?
I think it matters on its own merits and for all the strategic reasons that we heard about earlier today. the heritage, the cultural heritage dimension of the issues on Cyprus, rather than calling it the Cyprus problem, but the issues on Cyprus, I think, have strategic value, strategic impact, but also they can have strategic consequences that can be positive. And I think one of the things that can come from what some people would call low-hanging fruit when it comes to heritage engagement on heritage management across the Green Line is that there can be a demonstration effect. If there can be successes in Cyprus in a post-conflict partition space when it comes to the protection, the sustainability of heritage, and also the reigniting of the local economies that go along with those heritage sites and practices, we can replicate them in other areas of the region and outside the region. And I think if we look at what Russia is doing in terms of its war in Ukraine, one of the things we know is that it's been targeting heritage sites. And so what we see there is a lesson learned. Turkey has acted with impunity in northern Cyprus in the occupation zone. That's a message to other violators like Russia in Ukraine, or as with what China is doing in Western China, in Urumqi with the Uyghur Muslim community, where they're systematically destroying mosques and every other kind of heritage site that's associated with that community. So Cyprus matters for what it can teach us about violators who act with impunity and the messaging of that, and the steady corrosion of a rules-based international order. But in terms of some of the positive policy recommendations that I met, things that if you get wins in Cyprus or successes in Cyprus, they can be customized and adapted to other spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that you can learn a lot about the character of the regime or the government by looking at their behavior in these situations, the human rights behavior, and this visible destruction of sites and the cruelty to the people. And I was working on the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenia the last year or so, and everybody suspected Turkey had a role in it, in the invasion of Nagorno-Karabakh and the occupation and seizure of it. And siege of it, I should say, too. And finally, in July, Turkey seemed to admit it. It said it was going to invade Israel the way it invaded Nagorno-Karabakh. And Reuters said Turkey has denied any direct role in Azerbaijan's military operations in Nagorno-Karabakh, but said last year it was using all means, including military training and modernization, to support its close ally, Azerbaijan. So it's going to be coming up again and again. I think it's in northern Syria and Kurdistan. We worked on Kurdistan together, and Nineveh, and Turkey is militarily bombing some of those places,
right,
with impunity and against really historical enemies that it once eliminated.
Right, and I think, again, Cyprus is just a first step. Again, we're, I think by now we hear very frequently about Russia, Crimea, Russia, Ukraine. These are the first steps. And I think what is oftentimes not recognized about the Cyprus case is that that is a first step, and especially when it comes to the weaponization of cultural heritage. It's a first step that's being enacted in other parts of the region. And I also think, I went back to the institutions that have been replicated from Turkey into Turkish-occupied Cyprus that are charged with managing cultural heritage policy. The Diyanet, the Ministry of Religious Affairs, the Vakiflar, the Ministry of Foundations, tourism, culture. We see a lot of what's happening in Turkey happening in the occupation zone, but we also see Turkey being very open, the government of the Republic of Turkey being very open about the use of the Diyanet, which is a domestic institution, for its own foreign policy purposes. And so I think what we need to become a little bit more accustomed to doing is connecting these dots. And we work a lot on human rights and religious freedom issues, and I would say that cultural heritage is part of that. But the security community, which tends to focus on hard security, needs, I think, also to recognize that there's an overlap in our Venn diagram, and also for the human rights and religious freedom community to recognize there's a strict security dimension to this work. And so that requires, if we're talking about the US, a multi-agency approach. And I think that's something that, in terms of an incoming administration, that they need to think about. And going back again to the reports that are issued by the State Department, International Religious Freedom Office, and then the annual report of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, I think it's really important that any administration recognize that Turkish-occupied Cyprus needs to be included as part of the reports on Turkey, because Turkey is according to international law, is the occupying authority that bears full responsibility for what happens in that space.
Well, when you see the potential when a government like the United States has recognized ethno-cultural genocide, ethno-religious genocide of Uyghur Muslims in China, by China, the initial reports were coming out that the mosques were being destroyed and that they were imams were being forced to drink alcohol during Ramadan and dance in the streets, and then there was more reports and satellite images coming out of destruction of neighborhoods and building up of these detention centers. So it was extremely important. The cultural part of that, abolition of local languages, Turkic languages, architecture that they had used for centuries was being banned. And that it's happening and elsewhere in China as well, in Mongolia, Tibet. What about the human rights machinery? You started mentioning that, about the reporting. There is a mandate that Congress gave to the State Department to create an office, an ambassador at large for religious freedom, to do a short list of the world's worst countries for persecuting, and to report on every country we have a foreign policy with, and on an annual basis. So that's a pretty important mechanisms, machinery. They are required, the State Department is required to do this, regardless of the administration's policies. How could they be better used, and what about the role of the White House bully pulpit? I mean, even this name and shame. I remember when we were on the commission, we were so appalled by what we were seeing and hearing in Turkey. We went around and talked to all the minority groups, both in Turkey and in Cyprus, and that we actually recommended that the State Department include it as a country of particular concern on that short list of world's worst persecutors, because it had restrictions on them, and also denied that it was doing so, and denied the genocide against the Christians in the last century, which is part of this, part of the definition of genocide. Really, is a continuation in a way.
Right, right. And last week, I think November 11th, it was either 11th or 12th, was the anniversary of the death of Mustafa Kemal, who was part of the genocide, and Turkey continues to deny that genocide. But on an applied level, yes, the Commission designated Turkey as CPC, a country of particular concern, in 2012, our last year on the Commission, for its systematic and egregious violations of religious freedom. And I think what's important there, again, is to recognize that when we speak about religious freedom, or freedom of conscience, belief, and religion, that links directly to some of the cultural heritage issues. So access to property, ownership of property, free use of property, and all of the intangible practices that go therewith. The designation and the bully pulpit, I think, as you said, that's one way of addressing this. And I think in terms of the objective facts on the ground, there really isn't any doubt that these are systematic and egregious violations. But I think the other thing, and where the Commission, I think, has particular traction and the ability to do some good is in the more granular recommendations that it can make. And this takes us back to some of the things I mentioned at the end. For example, helping to find funding either from US government sources or from EU partner sources or from the United States for the Technical Committee on Cultural Heritage in Cyprus. Under our public diplomacy programs, trying to amplify the Youth Ambassadors Program. And again, that's a way, people-to-people diplomacy, of bringing the next generation together to recognize the significance of cultural heritage and human rights linkages, and perhaps develop different policies and work together on restoration and sustainability. There's also the possibility to find support for digitization projects that can ensure that cultural heritage sites that are in such disrepair that they're in danger of really just disappearing, that their digital footprints can be captured so that at some time, whether now or in the future, they can be rebuilt and restored. And those kinds of recommendations and the funding that goes with them are part of the work that the USERF does. So I think that's something that for USERF in particular, under the new administration or in the IRF office, or also at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, is focused on supporting faith-based communities and initiatives. So that's another space in terms of the local economies that go along with human rights protections and cultural heritage protections, where there can be some incremental movement.
Do you know if anyone in Cyprus is doing that work now? Any documentation on the churches? And I imagine some of the churches themselves, the monks and monasteries, are keeping track of where those churches are, which ones are falling into wreck and ruin.
And yes, and there's an entire digitization project at the University of Cyprus. I don't know the full scope of it, but it's dedicated especially to this very issue of making sure that there are captured digitized replicas and replicas of heritage sites.
And does the Turkish Cypriot Authority allow restoration projects?
Well, it's been part of the Cyprus Technical and Cultural Committee on Heritage. So it has participated with the Republic of Cyprus in these projects across both sides of the Green Line. But I think what needs to happen is that there needs to be an amplification, and certainly under the current Turkish Cypriot leadership, which is, toes the Erdogan line, that political will, much less capacity, hasn't been there. But there are some wins, and those are recorded on the TCCH website.
Yeah, I haven't been there since we went about over a decade ago, but I remember going and seeing a mosque that had been restored in Cyprus, in the south.
We visited the Sultan Tekke Mosque in Larnaca.
Yeah,
yes,
and it was in mint condition, beautifully restored. And then we went to the church monasteries in the north occupied area, and it seemed like the authorities were dragging their feet in fixing and allowing them to fix a leak or something like that.
We visited in the north, we visited the Apostolos Andreas site.
Yeah.
And that's subsequently been restored. But I think that's also a very important illustration of what I mentioned at the outset, either the lack of cooperation by the Turkish Cypriot authorities or the skepticism by the Republic of Cyprus and some of the other actors in the south about how cooperation on heritage issues can be weaponized again for political purposes related to sovereignty questions. But there have been successes, but those need to be dramatically expanded.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. As one of the maybe few persons in this room who's been in the occupied area every year since the checkpoints opened, except for the COVID year, and I've seen year by year the various proliferation of huge mosques and the usual desecration of over 500 churches, not all of them obviously, but some of them, and the heart-wrenching desecration of cemeteries as well, where bodies have been exhumed. But here's my question. You've alluded to it, but what does it ultimately mean at the end of the day when in 1998 It was about it was a 98-0 vote that created the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, which created the commission. And my recollection, there's at least 15 enumerated actions, from severe to less severe, or less severe to more severe, that the president has at his disposal with countries and for purposes of foreign policy that the United States has leverage with in countries that we deal with. So in the years that you were commissioners, and even to today, has any of those sanctions of any nature, other than just CPC, country of particular concern, and there are different levels of that, as I understand. I can't remember what the other one is. I think that's a middle level. I think there's a more severe level.
That's the most
Okay,
severe,
that's
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
But those sanctions, now I know there's always a presidential waiver of national security involved in all this, okay? What does it mean? At the end of the day, you pass these laws, you have these actions in place, do they ever get used, okay? Or are they just good talking points at the end of the day? So how can we move the needle forward? Okay, otherwise, just goes unabated.
Yeah, go ahead, you start.
No, you go
all right. It's, it's a good question, it's a fair question. Turkey is a member of NATO, second largest military in NATO. It's going to put the brakes on any kind of sanctioning, I think, or give pause to our government. That's the reality. And but that's why I emphasize naming and shaming in the bully pulpit, because that's something that can be done, and Turkey and no government wants to see that happen. They deny it. They deny they're guilty. They deny they're responsible. They explain it away. And it's important for them to deny it because it delegitimizes them. It morally delegitimizes them. And Turkey wants to have it both ways. It may want neo-Ottomanism, but it wants to be a democracy and have access to Western markets as well, and investment and defense. So and we recommended CPC, which is the pulling the trigger. The State Department didn't do it. The government didn't go along with our recommendation. So, and the commission, after we left the commission, overturned it. They didn't renew it. So that's my view, but Elizabeth, you're the expert, so.
Well, no, as are you, Nina. I think if you're asking, Nick, is there any value in these human rights offices and institutions? I think there's both symbolic value, but I think the other value is it sort of forces the United States to try and actually take action, lest it be, accused of hypocrisy. Now, what does that mean in terms of change on the ground? One example I can tell you where there was impact was in the case of India when we were serving on the commission. Mm-hmm. At the time, the current Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, was the governor of Gujarat province, and there had been extensive violence perpetrated against Muslims in Gujarat, and he was about to become part of a delegation to visit the United States. We recommended, and the State Department concurred, that he be denied a visa to visit. So I would say that that's one of the easiest tools that the Commission has in terms of recommendations, and the State Department IRF office has in terms of implementation. People like to come to the United States to do diplomacy and shop. I mean, they love it, okay? I mean, to put it in the vernacular. Deny visas to those individuals associated with those institutions that perpetrate the kinds of violations that we're discussing. That's the kind of low-hanging fruit, very targeted tools that actually can perhaps change outcome. Because what we had asked for in the Modi case was that he bring perpetrators to justice. So there was a series of trials. The conviction rates weren't that high, but nonetheless, they went through the process of the judicial process of bringing perpetrators to trial. So I think those are some of the things that we can do. And then the other thing too, I wanted to mention, the issue of commercialization of property. I think the United States can do more when it comes to our allies and partners to ensure that individuals from those countries who are purchasing property in the occupied north are encouraged by their governments, or their governments can take legal action to ensure that they don't purchase property. And here I'm talking the UK in particular, but also some of our allies in the Middle East who are purchasing property in the occupied north. That's where we can do diplomacy to say, you're buying property that is then used for private purposes or commercial purposes, and this won't stand. And so there are ways to do quiet diplomacy that can have an effect in the occupation zone. And then finally, on the commercialization side, I think going from occupied Cyprus back to Turkey, what we know is that, and it's incumbent upon people to sort of publicize this, what we know is that a lot of sites which have been appropriated or expropriated, and for example, what are advertised as the cave hotels in Cappadocia, well, those are actually monastic cells that date back to early Christianity, and those have now been repurposed into luxury hotels where people can access them through hot air balloons, and you see it all over, glossy Turkish advertisements and in their mediatized spaces. And so I think that one of the things that we can do is to find ways to ensure that properties in the occupied north and in Turkey that have been appropriated or expropriated cannot be used for commercial purposes. And maybe that's where other bureaus in the US government can get involved.